Testing. Yep, all good. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the session. Please take your seats. Let's start. Okay, welcome all to this session on Transport's new ambitions for NDCs 3.0. My name is Marcelo Carvalho. I work for the International Transport Forum. Let me first of all thank Korea for having allowed us the space for this discussion. In the next hour, we're going to lead from some leading voices from the Marrakesh Partnership, the Transport Thematic Group, and beyond. We'll reflect on recent progresses and explore the road ahead for transport's reflection in NDCs. So to begin, and I'm honored to invite the Secretary General of the International Transport Forum, Dr. Yante Kim, for opening remarks to our session.
I wanted to say something in Korean, but I don't see many Koreans in the audience. Unfortunately, I will go English. So, dear members of Marrakesh Partnership Transport Thematic Group, esteemed country representatives, dear colleagues, good afternoon. In 2025 marked the arrival of a new unified structure for the climate action agenda. The transport community has answered the call of the COP30 presidency by joining the multi-row across many fronts and spread across different priority axes and activation groups. This group and its initiatives have worked steadily to develop and accelerate solutions for maritime freight, aviation, green corridors, resilient infrastructure, and sustainable mobility, and many others. But that's not the only thing we have done this year. In 2025, many countries submitted and are still submitting the third generation of their NDCs. This group has contributed in many ways to help inform the development of this national commitment. We have produced templates and guidelines. We have supported capacity building efforts, and we have advocated for governments to shape transport commitments that are ambitious but also measurable and implementable. Now this is an occasion for us to take stock. What did our efforts achieve? Where did they land? And what opportunities are still out there? In this panel, we'll hear updates on these topics and more from colleagues working across different sectors of transport. As we initiate this Transport Thematic Day at COP30, I hope our discussions serve as a checkpoint, a chance to understand how transport is showing up in national climate plans, and where we could direct our future efforts to strengthen the sector's commitments and implementation efforts. Thank you for being part of this work. I wish you all an excellent event. Obrigado.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General, for your words and for this initial framing of the discussion. We will now move into our panel, taking this closer look at how transport has been represented in NDCs and what more can be done to ensure this representation. So I'm fortunate to be joined today by a diverse group of experts representing different modes and dimensions of sustainable transport. Let me first introduce our panelists and invite them to the stage. First of all, Akshay Yamdade, Policy Analyst at SLOCAT. Philip Turner, Head of Sustainable Development at UITP. Joo-Hyun Ha, Senior Advisor at UIC. Zofie Punte, CEO of Lifelinks and Board Member at the Smart Freight Center. And last but not least, Lauriane Crid, CEO of Europe Cyclist Federation. So we will start the discussion with a presentation from SLOCAT on what the global landscape of transport in NDCs is right now. So first of all, I would like to invite my colleague Akshay. So SLOCAT and GIZ have been working together on this tracker of NDC submissions. So we would like to know today, what does your work show? How does this compare with the global stocktake results? But also, what are the best opportunities to enhance the implementation of the stocktake outcomes through NDCs? So please go ahead.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Quite a warm afternoon today. Uh, First of all, thanks to Korea for giving us the space, and thanks to ITF colleagues and MPGCA partners for organizing this event. Especially in these conditions, it's really crucial to preserve transport space and all the initiatives along transport, given especially that 21.9% of CO2 emissions are coming from transport, of which 43% from freight and rest are from passenger transport. And it is the second largest energy consumer and still growing sector, with almost 27% of final energy use still being used by transport, and of which 95.4% is fossil based. And this ratio, this figure hasn't virtually changed for last 30 years. So something needs to be done. Yeah. So SlowCat and GIZ did start an NDC tracker where we look at NDCs submitted by all the countries, assess them, seek for opportunities where further enhancement in ambitions and actions could be accelerated. So thanks to SlowCat, GIZ, and this NDC tracker is being funded by International Climate Initiative of the German government. So the methodology that we are going to use in this is will have assessed 76 NDCs as of submitted by 3rd of November. Because after 3rd of November, there was still flurry of NDCs that were submitted. But this tracker, this methodology right now, it's just for 76 NDCs that were submitted as of 3rd November. And the very first thing that you would notice is of this 76 NDCs submitted, 75% are coming from LMICs, low and middle income countries, and only 25% from the high emitting countries. And then of this 75%, 67% are still conditional on NDC targets. So they are conditioned upon financing that is contingent upon international finances. So that's why the COP29 and the recent discussions in COP30 are very crucial in setting a good landscape for transport sector. So this tracker will analyze one 5-point plan for transport, which was produced by SlowCat earlier this year. You can scan the code and it has all the details. And to begin with, first thing first, 90% of NDCs include transport content. That is really good. At face value, that looks really, really good. And 61% contains transport-related targets. But how do this target fare up? So for mitigation, 87% include transport mitigation targets and 61% include adaptation targets. So of this 76 NDCs, that looks decent, but it's not enough, because for systemic transformation, we need $2.7 trillion funding that has to go through transport sector, and currently not enough is being done. As mentioned earlier, 67% of these targets that have been submitted are contingent on financing. So that's a very crucial point that has to be taken forward. And there are different finance-related actions that we detected in the NDCs. Majority of them are around vehicle taxation, fuel taxation, and a lot of countries have done brilliant work around that. So, since we have 5 minutes, I thought I would give just a quick state of play of NDCs and then really focus on the opportunities. So just to summarize the state of play, 76% generated, major emitters are still pending. There is limited reflection on global stocked outcome that concluded in COP28, because that stocked paragraph 28 included words like range of pathways, but in this NDC submitted, we are seeing that most of the measures are improved measures and not avoid and shift measures. So the range of pathways is really not being implemented. And this is mostly dominated by improved measures. Only 1/3 of the NDCs include finance-related transport actions, and that's not enough for systemic transformation in transport. And last but not the least, there are missing links in just transition, element of just transition. So here comes the good part. So Global Stocktrade concluded at COP28, and in paragraph 28, they they asked parties to focus on a couple of things, right? Road decarbonization through range of pathways. That's one opportunity that was not fully equipped in this NDCs. Another paragraph contained about transitioning away from fossil fuels, but still the content in NDCs is limited, and then tripling renewable capacity. So for each of these paragraphs, there are opportunities. For example, for range of pathways, avoid, shift, improve. That's the way to go. 50 to 60% of emissions could be reduced simply by avoid and shift measures. That is, avoiding unnecessary road motorized transport and shifting to less carbon intensive modes. But that is not being reflected, and most of the content is around improved measures, which is good but not enough. Second is transitioning away from fossil fuels. So at COP28, SLOCAT, REN21, and our co-initiators, IDRI, ITDP, UIC, UITP, they launched a call to action on doubling the share of energy efficient and fossil fuel free land-based transport. And that is another opportunity for NDCs, this NDCs and the next generation of NDCs that can fully utilize this call to action, ensuring that we could transition away from fossil fuels, because currently $7 trillion are being subsidized, is the subsidy given to fossil fuel industries, and 95.4% of energy consumed in transport is from fossil fuels. So there is a missing link, and this call to action could be the go for it. And then tripling renewable capacity and doubling global average annual rate of energy efficiency. So this was again in paragraph 28, and recently, just 2 days ago, SLOCAT and REN21 published a memo where we identified 5 nexus level how transport is not just a catalyst but also enabler of this target. Because you scale up renewables for transport, you're supporting tripling renewable energy target. As we assessed the 76 NDCs, we realized that mitigation actions were mostly skewed, that is almost 68 to 70% were just for improved measures and only 9% for avoid. That is very crucial, especially even though countries are different and national contexts are different for each and every country, 9% avoid measures are not enough to bring systemic transformation. So that's a very key opportunity for next generation of NDCs. And to conclude with, we believe that transport community should start conversation around setting a global goal for transport. Just now there were declarations by Chilean ministry, and a lot is going around. A lot of actors, transport actors, are fragmented. But if we have a global goal for transport, and if we start a structured process with ministerial leadership of setting up a global goal for transport, that would anchor all this fragmented, like avoid shift measures, into one tunnel, and this tunnel could be the one that is the best opportunity for all the for the entire transport sector to mitigate the worst effects of climate change, which would include both mitigation and adaptation, as this global goal will ensure that there is a sector-wide decarbonization. Parties will know that if there's a global goal, all the actions, all the quantified numbers, and all the quantified targets that they're coming up with are aligned with this global goal. And finances and elements would be shifted. Also leveraging UNFCCC platform, because there are a lot of disfragmented platforms which could come together with this global goal for transport. So that's from my side, that's from SLOCAT's side. Truly grateful for ITF and Korea for hosting us and our MPGCA partners. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Akshay, for this very insightful presentation. Indeed, at ITF, we work with 69 member countries, 69 ministers of transport, and we have developed together with the Chilean presidency of ITF recommendations for the integration of transport into their NDCs. And we understand that, if a global goal of transport were to be achieved or negotiated, that would have to leave room for each individual country to chart their path as well within those guidelines multilaterally defined. So with that said, let's go into our other panelists. I would like to start with Philip Turner from UITP. So what do you see are some of the most common barriers that countries are facing in integrating public transport specifically into their NDCs? And how has UITP helped overcome that?
Okay, thank you very much.
Try again. I think they just... Try again. I think they just
I think it's working now. Well, firstly, thank you very much for this, for the invitation today at this lovely pavilion. And I think when I look at some of the challenges, it really goes back to the second generation of NDCs, because when we did the assessment of how well public transport is accounted with them, often there were very kind of vague statements around expanding public transport or promoting public transport. So therefore, it's actually very difficult to assess progress and really what's going to be happening. So really as a consequence of that, and really feeding up to COP28, we developed an NDC template for public transport, which is essentially a guide or a checklist of how countries can include public transport better within their NDC updates that was submitted for this COP. And I think really, as I said, it's a guide and a checklist. It's not prescriptive, and the aim really is to raise that ambition, because I think the critical thing about NDCs is that 25% of the policy levers when it comes to urban public transport is actually at the national level. So national governments can enable the local level to deliver better quality public transport services. So hence that's why I think it's incredibly important for developing these templates. What we did was essentially do a review of 150 government policies looking at economic, regulatory, information, governance frameworks that can be put in place. And we surveyed city authorities, UITP members, so public transport authorities, operators, and businesses to say, out of this 150, what are like the 14 or 15 most important things that allow you to make you do your job better? And essentially it boiled kind of down to three things. And it was firstly the importance of setting targets for public transport in NDCs. There are some very good examples, even though I've said that there are many have been vague. There have been very critical good examples, and this is what we tried to highlight, that our recommendations are actually grounded in NDC reality, if I could put it that way. So I think there's the importance of technological development, so electric buses. So in Chile, in their NDC, the second generation, they had a target for 100% of electric buses by 2040. But there are also other elements. There's the importance of a modal shift. So Malawi had a goal for a 30% modal shift to public transport. But I think one important element is the need to combine them. There's no point having an electric bus if it's empty. I think when we look really at the policies and the actions that can be put in place, I think it really does focus on three areas. The importance of shifting mobility behaviours, so raising awareness. So Moldova has a national campaign about encouraging people to use public transport. Also around access, so El Salvador bases their investments on public transport access, so how convenient it is to get to a public transport stop. So that was in their NDCs. There's the importance of designing and financing cities, so earmarking revenue for public transport. So Canada in their second NDC earmarks 3 billion Canadian dollars per year from 2026 to 27. Road pricing and congestion, so getting people out of their cars, that was included in Bangladesh's urban planning around public transport, again in Mexico, and transit-oriented development. And that was included in Colombia and Uganda. So there are very good examples of how NDCs can enable cities. And this is where I think the importance of governance and regulatory reforms. So in Uruguay, they established a government commission on sustainable urban mobility. So really those are the key enablers, but you also need to monitor and report that. And more NDCs I see are looking at having urban indicators. Rwanda has that specifically. So I think what you can do is, around this template, you can really build capacity, not only for more ambitious NDCs, but also to support implementation.
Thank you, Philip, for this very illustrative overview of all of the nice examples that we have of public transport integration in NDCs. moving on down our line of speakers, we have Drew, and I would like to ask of you specifically about rail. What are some of the most effective ways that you have seen or that you have yet to see in NDCs to integrate rail into broader urban and energy planning frameworks within the NDCs?
Yeah, I think thanks for that question. And just to say, this is especially interesting to be in this pavilion. My family is Korean, but I was born in Brazil, so I feel like I'm doubly at home today, which is an interesting feeling. So thanks for the invite to be here today. To answer your questions, I think, yes, I think there's those two sides of rail planning, right? Like the urban side and the energy planning, and integrating those brings so many more benefits. First of all, like looking into the urban urban planning side, like Philip said, it doesn't matter if you have a great bus and you don't have any people inside. The same is true for rail. And the way that you get that is that you do transport-oriented development and ensure that you are putting rail in places where people need that transportation, and it is connecting to public transport systems, and that people can walk and cycle to the stations and feel safe in that way, and really bring the benefits of the avoidance and shift benefits that Akshay was talking about earlier in the message, by reducing emissions and making the journey convenient for people to take rail services. So in that sense, like urban planning and rail planning is really, really important to go hand in hand. And at the same time, energy planning is also the same, right? Rail companies are big consumers of energy, and so it is a big cost for them. And planning rail and energy services together can bring benefits to both, in the sense that it can help ensure stable supply, grid readiness, and coordinated investment. And this is something that we talked about a lot, I believe 2 COPs ago, with a call to action that was launched by SLOCAT. And so just to give you a few examples of what we have seen on the NDCs, UIC has done a similar NDC template, and based on the rail NDC template, we've done an analysis of the NDCs that we've seen so far. I think it was about 76 that we were able to analyze, and we've seen examples of countries that have integrated rail ambition into their NDCs, and some of them were in electrification. I will bring the example of Bangladesh, that has the target to electrify 348 kilometers of rail, with 80% of this target being conditional. So that means that they are seeking international cooperation mechanisms under the Paris Agreement to be able to deliver this enhanced ambition. And in that same NDC of Bangladesh, they have the target to deliver solar-equipped railway stations, and they also committed to install solar panels in 30% of their vacant land. Railway companies are large owners of land and land infrastructure, and so they're going to optimize the use of that space by installing solar panels in them. I also wanted to mention the example of Pakistan, which I think is a very interesting NDC, in the sense that they have a lot of goals in terms of rail, but they also, not only they mention like international cooperation needs in terms of financial additionality to be able to deliver that enhanced ambition, but they also mention like technological and capacity needs. And one of them is to help with their ambition on having green hydrogen in their rail systems, as well as being able to have smart corridors and long-term energy planning in their rail system. So those are the 2 examples that I could bring to the discussion today.
Thank you, Drew. Thank you for this. Let's say, looking at the holistic aspects of investment in transport, it's not it's always never about just transport. You have to take into account the housing system, you have to take into account the energy system, and transit-oriented development is one of the alternatives races. I know that Japan is one of the countries that has worked a lot on that, and I understand that Korea as well has explored some of these in their rail systems. So let's take it away from rail and go straight into active mobility with Lauriane. Lauriane, we would like to know from you what you see as the role of active mobility and electric non-motorized transport, and how do you see the integration of these active modes into recent NDC submissions?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. I mean, one thing I will mention, it's my first COP, and I'm here representing the European Cyclist Federations, but I'm also here representing PATH, so indeed active mobility. And up to now, I didn't know how many templates there were for NDCs. So now I'm putting myself in the space of a member state that has to deal with all these different transport things. And I understand a bit the complexity from a state's perspective as well. But obviously, many of the things that we do at PATH is linked to what we've heard. We've looked into how active mobility can help tackle climate change, obviously, can help having healthier populations. So it all ties into a lot of the objectives of the UN. Ultimately, 60% of urban trips are below 5 kilometers. They can be walked, they can be cycled. Of course, with electric bikes, you can actually even have a higher range than these 5 kilometers. What we did in our own little assessment of the NDCs in PATH is really looking into the difference, and I felt that was important, the gap between the number of countries that have active mobilities in their day-to-day planning, which was around quite a number, and we had 86 of these member states that had something in their national policies that didn't translate into NDCs. And I find this is super interesting for us to see, why wouldn't you take the opportunity to actually go for active mobility when you, in any case, are going to tackle it? I think the answer lies into the complexities of the different systems, the silos in between ministries that are in charge. It's essentially transport, but also environment, but also health. So that can be explaining part of it. But what we see in this iteration, and our report is on 71 NDCs, so we all have a bit of a patchwork. We took the end of October for our report. And in these 71s, we noticed that 8 of these member states actually put what they had into the NDCs. But we're still at 78 countries that actually have policies to promote walking and cycling on a day-to-day, and that didn't add them into their NDCs, pending, of course, looking into the ones that were given very late, I would say, or much later. So what we feel is that obviously we want to provide our own template, which we did, and to look into how to activate that, how to give them good examples of what's possible for them. Obviously, you have different level of development of infrastructures, you have different levels of different cities, but also beyond. And what we saw in the 71 we monitored is 59 of these had actually commitments on active mobility, out of which 27 were really explicitly mentioning walking and cycling. So 32 of them considered like, okay, walking and cycling is some sort of a side thing in something larger. 27 were saying only walking and cycling. And the beauty, what I find really encouraging from our perspective is out of these 27, almost all of them had dedicated finances measures. And that's what Philip was mentioning as well. We need the ideas, we need the financing, obviously, as well. So in terms of trends as well, if we want to be a bit more negative, there are these 8 that actually took on board the things. And we also have 6 countries that actually removed active mobility from their NDCs. And that's where it would be super interesting to deep dive a bit into why and how. Obviously, you have different political cycles, there are different reasons to do it, but why would you take out something that's a non-brainer for health, for mobility, and for climate change altogether? So that's something we'll be looking at in the PATH partnership moving forward, and that's just the opening.
Thank you, Lauriane. It's a very interesting point that you make about the reduction of detail and the removal of active mobility from some of the NDCs. And we have observed at ITF, because we have our own trackers, this trend of simplification of NDCs that is sometimes leaving behind several very important sectors. So we have talked about different modes. Now we will talk about a slightly different subject. We will talk about adaptation. So Sophie, with now more and more studies now showing that the 1.5 goal is virtually out of reach, Mitigation measures remain important, but adaptation is taking a more prominent role in the discourse. So in this context, how can countries ensure that they're also integrating transport adaptation measures effectively into their NDCs?
I had prepared both for freight and adaptation, so if it's okay, I'll couple the two
Sure,
a little
yes.
bit. Well, as we just heard, 61, I think, percent now have included adaptation one way or the other. I believe one country, Botswana, has actually put more emphasis on adaptation and on mitigation. And what you will see in the coming years is that especially developing and emerging economies will prioritize adaptation above mitigation. And I'll tell you why. Let's take Africa. Africa is responsible for, they've got 18% of the world's population, 4% of the emissions. So if you're in that situation, and if you have all your countries that are so impacted by climate change, are you then going to try and reduce that 4%, or are you then going to try and rescue whatever you can rescue? So adaptation is becoming more prominent, say even in the EU or Netherlands as a country, but where the focus still tends to lie is on infrastructure, hardware, the hard stuff. What is missing is very much the people stuff, the operations. And when it comes to the adaptation, the big word is flexibility. In actual fact, climate change is not a hoax, but adaptation in a way is, because we cannot adapt us out of this crisis. We can build resilience in our system to absorb as much of the impacts as we possibly can, but there's no way we can get rid of it all. So the one that I jumped out was Papua New Guinea. I found it really nice that they were, as a country, looking at sectors, agriculture, health, transport and infrastructure, as 4 priority sectors where they need to adapt. And the reason why I liked that one so much is because they had taken an integrated approach to adaptation in the context of the development of their country as an economy. And if you take, as a country perspective, how do we develop the economy in the future, and how do we then make sure that we build in resilience and we adapt to the climate crisis, you're much, much stronger than that. I then want to link it back with freight, if that's okay. A few, the NDC2s, there was very little focus on freight transportation, and if they had, it would be very much focused on modal shifts. Then now you start seeing much more on zero emissions trucks and zero emissions vehicles. And the reason is that for many countries, freight is a sector that's a little bit further away from what they know, just as adaptation is a subject that's further away from what they know. And what I've noticed in NDCs is they tend to adopt the solutions that the politicians already know and understand, right? That's why modal shift everybody gets. Now zero emissions trucks everybody gets, yeah? What I want to highlight furthermore about adaptation is, if you then look specifically at transport, we have a huge opportunity because of the global stocktake, highlighting transport as, as a dedicated sector. But when you then look at the National Action Plan Global Network, they published a publication called What Does First Global Stocktake Mean for the NAP Process? It's a document of 46 pages. It tells countries what should you include in the national adaptation in your national adaptation plans. Transport is mentioned 0 times. Yeah. The NDC partnerships also has advancing adaptation in NDC 3s. It was published April this year with 12 recommendations. Again, long report. Transport was mentioned once. Freight, not at all. So where the gap lies is that adaptation is rising on the agenda. It's very much focused on agriculture, food, infrastructure, but when they look at infrastructure, it's energy, it's water. Transport is often forgotten. And with that, I want to bring it back to what I think is an opportunity for the ITF and for all the other partners in the SLOCAT or other initiatives. We need to make sure we can develop something for transport on its own, but we're much more effective if we now devise a strategy. How are we going to infiltrate transport in every single sector on Earth? Why? Can you think of one sector that can survive without a functioning transport system? Absolutely none. Yeah? And that's what I would see is the next opportunity. I think currently it's a bit of a missed opportunity that we have not yet got the message across that transport is an integral part of the adaptation of all sectors, food, industry. That's an opportunity for NDC4, and I would hope for the next ITF summit in May next year.
Thank you, Sophie. Yeah, in fact, there is a lot of work to do still. Just to mention a little bit of the work that ITF has been doing, if you will allow, before the second round of questions, a little bit of merchandising for the ITF. We are currently in the middle of a trilogy of summits. We have a summit every year in Leipzig in Germany, usually in May. And earlier this year, we talked about resilience of transport systems. Next year, we're talking about financing resilience for transport. And the following year will be about governance of resilient transport systems. So this is an open invitation. Please feel free to find out more about the ITF Summit on our website. But going back to the panel now, and going back into adaptation a little bit, I would like to ask Drew, because when you talk about rail, usually you think about mode shifting and mitigation, but rail can also be used as an adaptation tool. So I would like to know from you, how can that be done as a key component for adaptation strategies in transport?
Yes, thank you for that question. I actually love that question because we often say that, or we like to say that investing in rail is a way for you to invest in both mitigation and adaptation and resilience at the same time. Which I think at the point that we are, we cannot afford to try to like separate the two. In a world where we have limited financing and priorities, I think we need to do the ones that we can achieve both. Rail is responsible for transporting 7% of global passengers, 8% of freight, and 1% of the emissions. So as we are right now, we're very, very low emission. And rail systems, yes, as large owners of infrastructure, we are exposed to a lot of these climate events, right? Like we're exposed to floods, to heat waves, to wind, to you name it. But there is a way that if you invest and plan properly, that you build resilience into the system and you build a future-proof rail system, they can operate under these conditions much better than other modes can. So in a way, this is investing in railways is also investing in resilience, and and because railways are often like centrally operated, they're able to fastly respond in case of an extreme climate event. If there is a flood, they can like manage traffic to go through the ways that are not compromised by the floods, and et cetera, et cetera. And actually, looking at the country examples of the NDCs, Vietnam, I think they don't mention this on their current version of the NDCs, but they mention it on the previous one, which I always like to bring up because I think it was the only country that actually put a money value to how much it would cost for operations of railways to stop in terms of like economic activity for the country. And they estimate that disruption to rail lines would cost $2.3 to $2.6 million per day if the rail corridor is compromised because of floods. And that's a really important view, right? Like, you know, if that stops, then all those people, they get to their jobs, those products don't get delivered, you know, what are you going to do? The good news is that on the NDCs that we've seen come out this year, we've seen some more mentions of adaptation in the context of railways, maybe because of what Sophie was saying. You see like more of this on the topic. But Brazil is a case where they clearly state they have a very lean NDC, but they mentioned that within the context of Adapta Brasil, which is the national plan for adaptation, rail is also actually mentioned as one of the priority areas for them. And this will allow Brazil to map better the climate exposure and provide targeted interventions to protect the rail system here in Brazil, which is mostly on freight anyways. And then the other example that I wanted to bring was on Morocco. So Morocco obviously has a lot of railways compared to other African countries. Excuse me. They have an unconditional NDC in which they refer that they will invest $1 million in the assessment to identify priorities, including heat waves, floods, landslides, and wind, to guide adaptation measures. So I think this is really, this is also very positive news that a country is actually, just dedicated into making that analysis and ensuring that they're bringing in that sort of first understanding what are their risks so that they can prioritize and invest in future-proofing their system. So that's a really good. And overall, I think this is really good news because by including adaptation of railways into NDCs just brings more attention to the issue. These climate events are not going anywhere. They're going to grow in number and in intensity in the future, and we need to protect these assets. And this puts a spotlight on the need to invest in that. So that's that. Thanks.
Thank you, Ju. And it's a really important point that you make connecting the rail discussion with resilience and adaptation, because we usually think of ports as the big international source of, for instance, infrastructure breakdown when you have a disruption. But rail, especially international rail, if you have any single point of failure in the infrastructure, that can cascade down into entire networks of freight. So thank you very much for making this point. Now, I would like to move on to Philip. And you made this point earlier, very briefly in your first answer. So given that the national governments are responsible for preparing and submitting these NDCs, but it's the local authorities that are on the ground regulating public transport, how and what strategies or what governance frameworks would work the best in order to ensure that cities are empowered to make this connection and to reflect their public transport priorities onto NDCs as well?
Okay, thank you very much for that. I used to work for Transport for London, and we had a kind of love-hate relationship with our national government. And I did realise that if you're the same political party, it really does help with that kind of collaboration between the two. When you're not, then life becomes very painful. I think from a kind of governance point of view, establishing a central kind of mobility authority is a really kind of important aspect, because that provides you with that governance framework to not only sort of drive your own policy within your city, so being able to do the urban planning, public transport coordination, being able to kind of self-finance, and so therefore not always reliant on your central government, I think is quite an important aspect, but regulate and do your own mobility planning. But I think it has to be reflected in that national government policy. So you do need a national government to say public transport is a priority for all our cities. And that can really help drive that kind of coordinated approach at the local level. So I think it is that kind of duality between the two. But like I said, having that central government, local government framework in place supports that coordination as well. I've talked about kind of the policies. If central government is earmarking financing for public transport in cities, they should really be mandating that to be monitored and reported back up to the national government. So what are the benefits that have been delivered from, say, the implementation of electric buses, new rail lines, new metros, so on and so forth? So not just the kind of, not just CO2, looking at the air quality benefits, looking at the access benefits, looking at how it's supporting the economy as well. So making that link to the wider government agenda, I think, is a really important bit. So that it's really that local level reporting back up to the national government. I look at the Sustainable Development Goals. Many national governments do not include any city data within their frameworks, even though that there is a whole goal on cities. I know for a fact in my country, you may be able to guess which one. We do have a lot of information on public transport reporting, but that's not reflected in the voluntary national reviews on the SDGs at the national level. So that there is a real kind of disconnect there. And I think you can also look at some of the issues in relation to the NDCs as well. I mean, we've looked at, the latest round of NDCs. Basically, absolutely none of them indicate how they have engaged local transport stakeholders. They've talked about how they involve their city governments, but not how they've dealt with the city's sectoral stakeholders. So I think that's an area of real improvement. I think there is a whole issue around capacity building. I mean, Pakistan in their NDC, they talk about their need for capacity building on how to deliver, electric buses, BRTs, etc. As UITP, we do a lot of training of the sector in order to deliver that. One of the things that we do not do is get national governments as part of these training programs. When I used to work at London, the amount of times I used to take policymakers into the tube to show them why their policies didn't work, because they didn't understand how the sector worked. And I think that's a really important aspect about that mutual understanding of what your issues are, what your challenges are, but also really what should work. So I think that's another kind of issue. I think there is also a real opportunity when you look at climate finance, especially carbon markets, because if you're including public transport interventions in your NDCs, you're technically eligible to get this new element of climate finance, which can make public transport projects bankable, de-risk investments as well. And I think if it's coming at that national level and it needs to be implemented at that local level, there is that real opportunity to really kind of have that engagement between the national and local level. But I also think that there is an opportunity around the UNFCCC in the negotiations itself. If there was more of a sectoral approach, I think that would really help. I mean, I looked at I was involved in the mitigation work stream where there was a specific focus on transport a few years back. And that was a really useful mechanism by which local stakeholders could engage with national governments. And I would love to see a more sectoral approach to these negotiations, because then you'd have to develop kind of roadmaps at a sectoral level, which I would hope that national governments would take back at home to develop that further and therefore engage your local level actors. So I think that there is kind of many opportunities around that engagement. It's not difficult, but we should be better at it.
Thank you, Philip. And you're giving me the perfect segue into the next question. You talked coordination across levels of government. You've talked coordination within the transport sector. And now I would like to address a question to Sophie about cross-sectoral coordination. So achieving this meaningful decarbonization of transport will require talking to energy, talking to urban planning, talking to several different sectors. So in light of these 2025 NDC submissions, what do you think are the most promising opportunities for us to ensure that this cross-sectoral collaboration can end up in transport decarbonization?
And specifically on adaptation or both?
As you wish.
Yeah. Well, I think, and I like to take the transport perspective again, because I think it's important also for the summit of next year. The key opportunity is supply chains. If you look at a country, we saw with COVID, what went first? It was supply chains broke down. If you see communities lose livelihoods, it's often because they're cut off from the world, either for access for medicine or food, or because their goods can't go anywhere. And the thing that connects supply chains is transport. Now, the moment you have your supply chains, you then need to think around trade routes or corridors. And I think the CPAP project of ITF is a really good one, where you're looking at, for example, the middle corridor, and you're looking at how can we make it more connected, how can we make it more digital or smart, and how can we make it more resilient and sustainable, right? So it's a really good approach. But by doing that, you can help countries put their NDCs in the context of the supply chains they depend on, either for goods they need or for trade or export they make. So I think that's where. And the moment you then look at your logistics or transport system that supports those trade routes or supply chains, you need to think not only of the infrastructure, but also of the operations and the workforce, as I explained before, and of the supporting systems around it, like the energy system, but also the water system is very often very important. How interconnected the rail, the road are, because if those connections break down, then often your system fails where the weakest spots are. Yeah. And then the third area where I think the ITF has this corporate board with many companies from multiple sectors. Now expand that opportunity to see which are the supply chains that are so vulnerable to breakdown at the transport sector that they would have a real interest in building the resilience here. So take an example. Fresh produce from east of Africa going to Europe, yeah? The moment that would cut down, they would lose a lot of export, but Europe would lose a lot of avocados, vegetables, flowers that they depend upon. Another one is the textile industry. A lot of the fashion comes from Asia, going into Europe, going into the US, and many of the livelihoods in those communities, or several of your member countries, are dependent on those supply chains for survival. But of course, the Americans want to continue to have access to cheap clothes, right? So they have it as well. And the companies that support those sectors have a benefit in keeping those supply chains alive, yeah? And the third one is, of course, to do with decarbonization, which is the energy transition. We depend on copper, we depend on lithium. If those supply chains break down or it becomes super expensive to transport those critical raw materials, then that whole transition to a decarbonized future will be delayed. And again, there are many companies, IT companies included, who have deep pockets of money who would really understand that. So the cross-sector collaboration then lies in putting transport as a critical link in all supply chains around the world, finding the companies that back them, finding the countries within your membership that are dependent on some of those key supply chains, and then figuring out what are the priority actions for both decarbonization and adaptation that we could co-invest in together to keep those supply chains alive, to keep them reliable, and to keep them cost effective, because in the end that's what both countries, companies and consumers care about.
Thank you,
Does
Sophia.
that answer your question, yeah?
Yes, of course. And I couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you for mentioning also this ITF work that we have developed.
And if I can make a smaller thing, I made a LifeLinks framework that explains how this is done. So if you want to have access to that, it's free, and I developed it over the past year. It's almost a personal PhD. So this is how it's done. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. Okay, well, let's move on to the last question of this panel. Lauriane, so building on the way that active mobility has been or hasn't been included in the most recent NDCs, what do you see as the main implementation challenges for scaling up cycling and walking infrastructure, especially if you're talking about developing countries or rapidly urbanizing countries? So what are the pending challenges on that?
Yes, thank you very much. So indeed, I think one point that I wanted to mention, if you look into the numbers from 2023 to 2025, we went only, I would say, from 52 to 59 commitments. So it's growing. We can be positive about that. It's not growing fast enough, especially bearing in mind this reserve are about 78 countries that already address walking and cycling. I think what Philip mentioned around politicians and the changes and the cycles and the governance, that's very key. So that's why it's important to enshrine walking, cycling, and active modes in your daily policy briefs, and the NDCs are a nice way to do that, because then you engage yourself on the long pathway. I do think one of the key levers is obviously financing. That's one of the levers that is tricky and that needs to be addressed, because part of this is it's much easier to plan an infrastructure from the get-go into something that's livable for citizens than it is to change and transform cities that have been built for cars over decades into something more livable. So rapid urbanization is also a chance if you tackle it from the beginning and if you have the right financing there. What I'm quite hopeful about is that it is a societal thing. I hear a lot around where we've been doing a lot on infrastructure, we've been doing a lot on systems and technologies. We need to put people at the center. that's definitely something that needs to be said, and that's something that when it's being done at local, regional, national level might not be as popular, but ends up being positive for society as a whole. So it demands some courage, it demands some long-term vision, and that's what we're currently lacking here in a view. What I would add is a challenge is really this fact that some countries are removing their commitments. And I will leave it at that because we have 5 minutes left.
Oh, you can continue. No worries about it.
No, but exactly. In terms of the challenges, it's really this long-term commitment and into getting more active in cycling in the heart of what we do. I used to work for some of a different mobility actor, but I've always said none of us is just one thing. I fundamentally believe in that. I hate opposing modes. I am a pedestrian. I'm a cyclist. Occasionally car user, public transport user, train user, plane users to come here as well. And I do think we need to encourage the societal into thinking, what's my best way from A to B? For that to happen, we need to have the safe infrastructure. And that's really why we're working on that on PATH. So,
Thank you, L'Oréal. Well, I guess we're not going to have time for a very long Q&A session, but perhaps if we could have a very quick tour de panel, I guess, with our panelists here. Looking at the long term, we know that the action agenda this year has several different priority axes, several different activation groups, and transport has been kind of spread out. We are, I won't say stretched, but we are in several places and we are divided in a way. So how do we maintain this cohesion that we have had over the times and this group that we have established over the years to concentrate all of the different modes, all of the different aspects of transport decarbonization, and maintain this cohesive action, this unique voice for transport for coming years? What do you see as pathways for us to continue this work? Perhaps we can start from here and then...
Okay, well, I'll take that one because I was actually involved in the cities aspect of the action agenda, which looked at urban mobility. And we developed a plan to accelerate solutions with a number of urban stakeholders within that framework. It is true that it's Transport Day today, and that was a different track. But I think these plans to accelerate solutions are really that opportunity to build those bridges, but also look at the gaps where there are. I mean, urban's well covered, hard to abate is well covered, but rural isn't. So I think we need to see how we can fill those gaps, look at the synergies, and really use these activation plans to build that golden thread between the different modes across the transport sector.
Thank you, Philip. Anyone else? Drew?
Yes, I think for me, just taking from the presentation that Akshay made earlier on the global stocktake, that paragraph 28G, I memorized that, that says we need to accelerate the reduction of emissions from the road transport in a range of pathways. And I think all of us here in this panel represent a different sector, but if we work together, we represent that range of pathways through which we're going to reduce the emissions from the roadside transport. So I think it's continuing this collaboration, continue to work together, continue to be loud at these spaces and try to occupy and make sure that we are heard, and not only talk to ourselves, but also make sure that these is being heard by countries and by negotiations and other spaces, so that we can achieve the decarbonization that the transport sector needs.
Thank you, Drew.
Yes. What I would do is I would build on the global goal of transport that was announced today and develop a few goals for transport as a whole. And I think ITF and SLOCAT, having led the COP thematic group for transport for a while, could do that. And then ask all the members of SLOCAT and ITF, how are they contributing to that? And then, in a way, it's a good thing. We've infiltrated everywhere. That's why we spread out. So turn the potential risk in a huge opportunity by saying we're just going to be loud and clear. We just need to be organized as a sector around some common own goals for transport, and with a clear strategy how we're going to infiltrate everywhere, so that every speech about adaptation, mitigation, resilience here at COP at least always mentions transport once. That would be a really good way. So I think it's an opportunity. I see the risk, but I think it's an opportunity for us to really make sure transport is reflected everywhere at the right place and not always on the last. Yeah.
Thank you, Sophie. Lauriane, you have...
We have no time left, and I think that the conclusion was perfect, so let's leave it there and release everyone.
Thank you. Please, a big round of applause to our panelists. Thank you very much for coming.